Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the two closing arguments from Donald Trump and Kamala Harris and the distractions that both parties have suffered as they try to make those closing arguments. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. Earlier this week, we saw Donald Trump do a rally live from Madison Square Garden. He was introduced by Melania Trump. That's the one person I saw when I tuned in ahead of Trump, but there was a big slate of speakers before that, including kind of stand-up insult comic of some kind, and he called Puerto Rico a floating pile of garbage. I don't think that's a line from Leonard Bernstein's The West Side Story, where there's a kind of sarcastic number about Puerto Rico sung by Puerto Rican characters. Did any of you see the rally? What'd you make of the controversy around it? Was it a reenactment of the 1930s rally that took place in Madison Square Garden? What'd you guys see in here?
One thing that stood out to me was evidently the comic in question had also intended to call Kamala Harris a C word. And this was apparently censored, or, he was told not to do this. So in other words,
what is wrong? What is wrong with people? Why would you do that? That is so crazy.
So what's interesting is that I guess the Trump team, part of what you see here is the kind of swirling chaos where there isn't really much control of what campaign surrogates are saying. And, that says quite a bit about how Trump governed last time and how he'll govern again, just in terms of it being kind of just a swirling chaos machine. But, they did nix him.
Sorry, Geoff, how he'll govern again. Are you calling it for Trump?
No, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, it still would say it's a coin toss, but I think you do get it does tell you something. I would say less in terms of the content itself, so much as the kind of people he surrounds himself with and the sort of chaotic kind of carnival environment they tend to create, which we all remember from, in some cases almost fondly from his first term. But I think so that this comic, but it is notable, I think, that he was told not to. Like the one place where he would have been going over the line was calling Kamala the C word on, national television. So, and I will also note that Elon Musk's super PAC put out a commercial which repeatedly calls Kamala, quote, the C word, unquote. And then the supposed joke at the end is that this refers to communist. But it repeatedly says, this ad, over 30 seconds or so, Kamala Harris is a C word, blah, blah, blah. So they're clearly, the sort of brilliant, sort of junior high level minds behind this campaign are clearly really fixated on this idea that there's something really great about just, about using what I'd say is still the most stigmatized profanity, and at least in American English, as far as I'm aware.
Do you think any voters seeing that ad, say in suburban Pennsylvania or Center County or the Milwaukee suburbs, find that ad a little bit off-putting?
I mean, it's hard to know who it's going to. It's again, it's Elon Musk's super PAC. I don't know whether it's being broadcast on TV or it's just an online ad. But so unclear who it's actually going to. It may just be targeting the kind of Musk super fan sort of X users and so on, rather than the broader public. And I think there is probably a lot of micro targeting going on, particular. And so I guess the principle behind it is to activate these kind of younger men who are who are highly mobilized by sort of Musk's particular messaging as a surrogate. That would be my guess. But in any case, they did nix that, but they did give the green light to Puerto Rico as a garbage, pile of garbage, which I guess says something. What strikes me there is like I don't really, I find all the whatever pearl clutching and so on annoying, but at the same time, it's just like it seems obviously really dumb because this is ostensibly a voter bloc that the GOP has been making gains with. I mean, Puerto Ricans are citizens, and if they're in Puerto Rico, they don't vote for president. But a lot of them, particularly after Hurricane Maria came over, and in fact, have been voting in large numbers for Ron DeSantis. So they're certainly kind of considered a gettable demographic. And I've had Puerto Rican friends. They tend to be pretty patriotic. Although not, they tend to not be sort of they tend to combine American patriotism with Puerto Rican patriotism. So just doesn't seem good. Um, Beyond that, there was just kind of a bizarre, again, just like the sort of bizarre messaging of it, where you had Tucker Carlson say that describe Harris as a low IQ Samoan Malaysian, which again is just kind of weird because again these are I mean Samoans, like as I understand, are actually a pretty conservative demographic group. A lot of them are evangelicals and Mormons. Um,
Very,
I've met a
very
few in my life.
conservative.
So
Yeah, yeah. An important Trump surrogate, Tulsi Gabbard, is part Samoan.
that's right.
Her
Yeah, yeah.
her father, from whom she gains her Samoan ancestry, was a very prominent socially conservative activist, leading opponent of same-sex marriage in Hawaii in the early 2000s, and that kind of gives you a flavor of the political tenor of a lot of
Yeah.
Samoan.
One factoid that I looked up. So Samoa doesn't have a voting member of the House of Representatives, obviously, because it's a territory. However, it has what's called a U.S. House delegate, which is basically someone who represents the interests of Samoa in the legislative branch and is allowed to participate in debates and all sorts of deliberations. Just doesn't vote. And that person, I looked her up. She guess what? She's a Republican. And she's also a standing member of the Republican National Committee. So it's like, what? Like, what? Why go after Samoans?
Yeah, very bizarre. And then why go after Malaysians when one of Elon Musk's closest friends and most constant interlocutors on Twitter is the great Ian Miles Chong, one of the most brilliant analysts of American politics, despite being based in Kuala Lumpur. So yeah, it's strange that they would allow Carlson, who is essentially an employee of Elon Musk, to insult the nationality of one of Elon Musk's best friends. But so I don't really understand what the it really seems like a strategy of chaos. You had, I think, somebody also call Harris the devil. It's far beyond. I remember like in the '90s when there was like when I was quite young. I vaguely remember what was the convention where like Pat Buchanan declared the culture war and so on, and there would be these RNCs where there would be just that they'd really let the hardline sort of religious conservatives give these fire and brimstone speeches, and then everybody would be kind of scandalized by how shocking and extreme it was. It really seemed like this was a weird combination where you had some elements of that, like Harris is the devil, and then you also had this kind of shock jock sort of '90s Andrew Dice Clay style stuff. So it's a weird, and kind of going to what Ryan Zickraff wrote for us the other day about this Musk rally and evangelical church. It is this kind of union of these two poles of '90s American culture, of kind of the obscene, um, kind of freewheeling, say whatever you want, just rampant sort of misogyny, racist jokes, like, which is something people sometimes on the right will be like, oh, it was so nice when we didn't have like the woke thought police not letting us tell these jokes. But then you also have what at the time was kind of an opposed element of '90s culture, which is the sort of fire and brimstone religious right. So it's a very it did showcase that very odd coalition, which Ryan wrote for us a column called "The Gospel According to Elon Musk" that sort of covered this weird fusion that you see of these kind of '90s to early 2000s cultural formations. And I think and it's worth mentioning RNCs, like it's worth comparing it to the quite tightly choreographed and orchestrated Republican National Convention, which was actually studiously moderate on many things, both in its rhetoric and in its treatment of the issues. So it's a very strange contrast. I don't know whether to attribute it to kind of overconfidence. All we have to do is fire up the base. Although, in some sense, like the Trump campaign really had better reason to be overconfident at the RNC, during the RNC, according to the polls at the time. So, because the sort of Biden senescence scandal was still so recent, and there was kind of the rallying behind Trump after the assassination attempt. So, it's odd that there's been this massive kind of rhetorical shift from, again, an attempt to project this more moderate Trumpism that I think both. I mean, certainly on an issue basis, there's a strong case that is a realistic depiction of a great deal of Trump's appeal as his moderation. But at the same time, there's this kind of bizarre veering into the most outlandish and sort of carnivalesque performances, and just again a kind of lack of interest in toning down any of these just kind of strange and just openly antagonistic sort of statements that gratuitously threaten to offend potential voters or members of your own coalition. So very, very strange spectacle.
Now, we haven't got into Trump's actual closing message at the rally, and I don't want to get into that yet because I think first I'd like to talk a bit about the optics of Kamala's event on Tuesday night, billed as her closing arguments, recalling her days as a prosecutor, and offered in the same spot where Donald Trump spoke on January 6th. And Sohrab, I wonder if you can just offer your observations on the optics of Kamala's event as opposed to her message, and then also on the other news story that distracted from it and brought garbage back to the center of public discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it was just unfortunate that from a Democratic perspective that President Biden couldn't just stay away, because I do think look, I don't think it was like it's partly so maybe an MSG the rally there was partly a self-inflicted October surprise. The October surprise is usually what the opposing party does to you, digging up some dirt at the 11th hour when it's too late for you to try to adjust or kind of message your way out of the trouble. In this case, to insult Puerto Ricans at a time when the party is trying to present itself as a party that's bringing in new voters, people of color, and in that way, it did hurt. I mean, I think it's important to talk about the ramifications politically. There are about 500,000 Puerto Rican Americans in Pennsylvania, several hundred thousand more ranged across battleground states, and all these Puerto Rican celebrities, some of whom are pretty apolitical, like reggaeton stars and Ricky Martin, each with millions of followers, blasted it out to their fan bases, saying, "This is what the Republican Party thinks of you." And so it was basically like, take that win, Democrats, pretty good. But then President Biden couldn't stay away from the mic, and he goes there and he says the only garbage are his supporters. Um, and there's been just don't ask me to like parse the exact quotation because because of the way Biden speaks, which is in this disjointed with a weak voice, disjointed sort of syntax. There's been like all this sort of intense scrutiny of what he was trying to say, whether he meant to refer to his supporter, meaning that comedian with an apostrophe S, or he was talking about all Trump supporters as such, which would again it'd be that's to insult an even larger group of people than the Trumpian comedian Hinchcliffe. So that's I'm sure I could just imagine the collective groaning, in the Kamala Harris campaign of Kamala Harris herself and Waltz, just like, Biden, could you not have just stayed out of this altogether? Um, so, I think that muddled what was a pretty good hit against a self-inflicted hit against the Republicans by Republicans, and that it became the story. The, I think overall, I just with Kamala now. I'm turning to answer the first half of your question, Matthew. With Kamala, I just nothing about Kamala Harris, including the optics of her closing message and the substance of her closing message. Nothing really just grabs you. It's just like policy wise, what am I gonna do for you? I don't know. I can't quite like what's the pitch here? And where's the beef, as people say in American politics? Where's the beef here? I don't know. Um, I think it came alongside. It's worth commenting on this Michelle Obama speech in Chicago, which was addressed to men in many ways, and trying to get men to vote for Kamala Harris. And it was obviously against a backdrop what's called the kind of gender education polarization. So like men, especially men without college educations, are just overwhelmingly for Trump. Women who tend to be more educated anyway, that's like the development of our society, are very much for that Kamala Harris and the Democrats. And this speech was supposed to like bridge that divide. And basically it was Michelle Obama hectoring, non-college men, basically saying you have to support Kamala Harris because women need abortions. And it's just like, how is that going to achieve what you want to do? And I honestly, I mean, I talked to people, and there are Democrats on supporters of the Democratic Party on, among my and Matthew's friends and followers, who are just like, I'm looking. It feels like the message is you have to vote for Kamala Harris so your wife or girlfriend can continue to have abortions. Which, look, I get that pro-choice is pretty big for the left. I get that for a lot of American women as such. Um, I get that, but like, really, that's if you had to sum up a campaign, it should be like especially its message to a group that it doesn't seem to be able to resonate with, namely men. Your message is like abortion for your sister, girlfriend, or mom, or whatever. It just really, I don't know. So the optics are bland and the message is odd to me. But look, on the other side, they're just telling these, racist jokes and alienating the other demographics on their own, even though for several weeks they'd been doing pretty well. So who knows? Kamala may still pull through.
Yes, and I think you're right to say that Kamala's message is a bit diffuse. What she tried to, I think, show us in the closing argument was a picture of order as opposed to the disorder of January 6th. So, there was her vice presidential podium, a symmetrical arrangement of flags behind her, the White House visible in the background, these very, very classical, balanced scene, suggesting harmony and calm and strength. And the crowd was engaged and enthusiastic, but restrained and, just all in formation. So that's kind of what you saw there. And then in terms of her message, it is a bit diffuse. She's talking about unity. She really stressed in her speech that she doesn't regard Americans who disagree with her as her enemies. She wants to talk with them. She wants to hear from them. So it was meant to really form a contrast between herself and Trump. And Biden's gaffe undermined that profoundly. And also, I think the media reaction to the gaffe, with many people saying, "Oh, well, no, Biden didn't say this about all of Trump's supporters, or it's not at all clear he meant to say it about all Trump supporters," more modestly, and I think in that case, actually defensively, given Biden's incoherence, it just reminded people of the way the scales are often tilted in these discussions. Because certainly Trump or Trump's surrogate would not have received such a patient and charitable response from the media, because it's understood that he is fascist or very orange and very bad. Otherwise, in Kamala's message, yes, she hit abortion rights. She at once presented herself as more supportive of freedom and also a better protector of Americans than Donald Trump. So freedom's a very strong theme. She's really running to his right, or kind of in economic terms, on things like tariffs, which he calls his 20% national sales tax. She's running it from a more free market perspective. At the same time, she promises to fight price gouging with groceries, subsidize first-time home buyers, things she mentioned in her speech. So it's a mix. It's not an entirely clear contrast between the two candidates on this spectrum of economic liberty versus economic protection. I think the message is just a little more diffuse, and Trump's, I think, is more focused. And what you saw him say at Madison Square Garden, really a condensed version of his campaign rallies, of what he's been saying for weeks. Uh, his he said, a version of a line he's repeated many times. Uh, I will protect our workers. I will protect our jobs. I will protect our borders. I will protect our families. So that notion of protection and the stress on workers, jobs, borders, families, it is a notion, and then the R. Uh, it's an assertion of a kind of economic and cultural nationalism. I'm going to put Americans first. So Trump hit that message hard. I think his speech was more focused and successful in that way than Kamala's, uh, which isn't to say that it will prove more appealing or will actually be heard by the voters who matter.
Yeah, I do think Trump has on the policy front has like a simpler, clearer message. I just you cannot deny that. It just has a jobs, border, security, and the home front. Just simple. I mean, it's as simple as "Make America Great Again," which was such a. I mean, obviously, it's like a brilliant, well, epically brilliant campaign slogans of all time. Obviously, you can't repeat it now. It's just called the MAGA movement. It's set in. So still campaigns need that simplicity, that sum up like what I'm voting for in this clear way. And I at the risk of repeating myself and echoing what Matthew and Geoff both indicate, is I just cannot do that as crisply with Kamala Harris. And partly you can't blame her, because she's an incumbent who's trying to be like, I'm different from Biden. I'm something new. I don't know. You can't entirely blame her either for this predicament, but we'll see.
Yeah, 100% agree on the Kamala messaging. It's just it's a bizarre sort of throwback to this kind of just this very like safe focus group kind of messaging, where you just come up with these like sort of micro targeted proposals, like protect black men's crypto assets, and give small business loans to some specific category of people. It feels a lot of the time like a sort of parody of Clintonian, kind of like what if you made a TV show that was sort of parodying the fecklessness of the sort of third way policy era. Like this is the kind of stuff you might come up with as a joke. Honestly, it's really quite bad. I think on the bigger picture, the more important stuff is actually completely substance free and is completely procedural. And I think in a sense what they're aiming for is not to come up with any memorable kind of policy proposals, and hopefully they think get away with that, and instead just project sort of normality, stability. And this is part of why Biden's kind of bumbling statement was bad. Not I guess my tendency is to think he probably, just contextually, he probably did mean like the people on the stage saying crazy shit, and not like the entire voting base, but that's kind of what it looked like to me. But it kind of doesn't really matter because, the problem is really that you have this, if you're trying to project like we're the normal competent people, it's just not good to have this kind of bumbling grandpa like say really embarrassing and stupid sounding stuff. And it also just raises the question of like, this guy still is the president. So if you're the competent normal people, why is that the case? Like what's going on here? So I mean, I would say the bigger issue raised by that gaffe was not even just the content of it, but the fact that it completely contradicts, I think, this larger message they want to show, which again is this, going to the scene of the crime of January 6th and projecting like we're the ones who will bring stability and order and competence, and then having this rambling kind of nonsensical statement from the person who still is in fact the head of state. Like it's a real clash of visions there. So yeah, I thought that was quite striking.
Actually, if I may, Geoff, I want to just kind of push back on one element of what you said. I think in context, it's hard to know exactly what Biden was trying to get at given his lack of fluency. Uh, but one reason that I think it is too much to sort of presume that he didn't mean to indict all Trump supporters, but just meant to criticize the people on stage is the way he spoke. He has spoken about Trump supporters in the past. So he gave a very high profile speech in Philadelphia uh, a year ago. And in that speech, with its very kind of dark and gothic optics, he said Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic. So the idea was really, if you're Trump or someone who supports Trump, you threaten this nation. So it's not calling those people garbage, but I mean, if people are threatening the foundation of the republic, calling them garbage seems, if anything, euphemistic. So that's one of the problems. Biden has engaged in a really extensive, if generally more high toned rhetoric of denunciation against Trump supporters. And that's, I think, one reason why this remark has a little resonance.
Yeah, I think that's true, and obviously it recalls the deplorable stuff. I will push back though on my end, which is I know you guys like JD Vance. He did blurb a book called The Unhumans by Jack Posobiec, which literally refers to the left, by which they mean, the entire Democratic Party and its supporters, in the title as unhumans. So, and interestingly, I mean, clearly, yes, there are double standards. The press tries to clean up what Biden said. As far as I know, this is never, I mean, Michelle Goldberg wrote a column about this, but the fact that Vance, in the course of this campaign, appeared on the top of a cover of a book, essentially calling half of the country unhumans, has, as far as I know, never been a controversy. It's never been discussed at all. So it's kind of curious to me, actually. I think the question of like what's getting brought up as a potentially disqualifying kind of statement about the other side's supporters and so on is actually a bit more ambiguous than that, because if the media were just purely doing the dirty work of the Democrats, I find it quite strange that they haven't taken the opportunity to bring up the fact that this book exists. And is written by somebody who like was a major proponent of Pizzagate. And yeah, I mean, calls and actually praises Franco and Pinochet, both of whom committed, large scale political massacres of their political opponents. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I find all the kind of sanctimony and tut-tutting about, like, I'm not saying I wish that they did bring this up, although I think it is kind of an interesting fact about Vance. But it does seem to me that it's not quite as simple as the Democrats demonize all Trump supporters, and nobody ever criticizes them for it or calls them on it. And meanwhile, anytime Trump says anything, or Vance says anything, that they they get completely slammed for it. I think it's a bit weirder. I mean, there have been a lot of weird things coming out of the Trump camp that have actually not really been big stories this year. I think partly because people are just the baseline is people assume that a lot of that stuff is just crazy and weird, and so they just kind of ignore it and don't consider it a story anymore. But I don't know. I'm curious, but I'm curious what you think of Vance endorsing a book calling Democrats unhumans versus Biden calling MAGA Republicans extremists, which I did write a column criticizing at the time, the Biden speech. So I don't know. But I am curious actually what both of you think about.
Right. So certainly, I think it would be precious to single Biden out as you engaged in uniquely uh, divisive rhetoric, which I hope it didn't seem that I was doing. Uh, Rather, my intent was to simply illustrate why I think these comments have some resonance. I think part of this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, Geoff, about this uh, desire that both parties seem to have at moments to assert something like the standards of decorum that maybe Tipper Gore was the last authentic defender of, uh, while at the same time speaking in a more immediate and visceral way. Uh, so yeah, both parties do it. In terms of the why hasn't Unhumans resonated? Maybe just the bizarre and seemingly semi-literate title is part of the reason. Uh, but yeah, I mean, certainly the the broader issue you raise, which is the uh, for JD Vance in particular, and then I think for the Republican Party more broadly, its intersection with some of these kind of weird online cultures and ways of speaking. I think he has had to pay a certain cost with that, and one would hope, or maybe hope's too strong, but one you know might like to think that the way this campaign has gone would raise some questions about the wisdom of doing that.
Yeah, I'll try to be the synthesis here. Shout out to the Hegelian e-girls. And but what I mean by that is I think there's something to be said for the return of political taboos. And now this is going to be a half-baked idea because it's only half-baked in my head, and I'm working on it as an essay, in part as like one of those essays that will kind of become a building block of the book we discussed on this podcast, my new book. But yeah, I think we went through this age probably more so on the right, where the idea was like we've just been constrained in how we speak, and what we need, like we have these deep crises that need fixing, and we just got to be able to speak about them gruffly. And I think it's fair to say that, like, at least two of the people on this podcast have well, I won't speak for Matthew, but certainly for myself, that I've been through that because Matthew and I, coming from the kind of more populist, communitarian, Catholic, whatever kind of new formation on the right, circa 2018-19, ran up against the right's own kind of National Review type civility police and the constrictures that imposes. And we're like, well, we got to be able to. We've got to be able to speak, and I think that's an intellectual microcosm, and it's been reflected in a wider sphere online, but also off of people who have had that impulse. And I think what we're recognizing, and maybe the left will come to a similar conclusion, and it depends on what happens on November 5th, honestly, but that there is something to be said for seeking out the most elevated, sort of dignified ways to say things, even as you're honest, even as you try to make your sort of sharpest polemical point, because after all, it's politics. It's not social work. It is antagonistic by definition. But like a mode of politics has arisen, I see it a lot on the right, so I sometimes maybe diagnose it or overdiagnose it on the right, where it's like, you know, actually there is no deeper substance that's like putting forward a positive vision to counter the one that people on the right don't like. All there is just like, ha ha ha, I get away with saying like the nastiest thing about you. And yeah, like there is a version of that on the left, which is, of course, I think is just the kind of constant use of Nazi, fascist, et cetera, in ways that are ahistorical and untethered from the American tradition. But I do wonder if there's any like, okay, we're going to go through a contentious election, but it is worthwhile for political antagonists on both sides to think about, like, okay, has something been lost in the loss of the kind of political taboos that made us not say things like, Puerto Rico is an island of garbage, or the dark MAGA speech on Biden's part, where he just like described a vast swath of the country as basically evil and irredeemable. But then, but without then just going back to a mode of civility policing that um, served to stifle actual political contestation that needed to happen. And I don't have an easy answer for that.
I want Geoff to get in here again, kind of wrap this up, but I first want to make a slightly less serious point, which, calling Puerto Rico floating pile of garbage, it did make me think of that meme, which was once more popular online, of, a kind of brain scan or something, and then you see some light emanating from the brain, from this head, and then it's as if it's exploding, and so it's the kind of, this is the basic take, this is the brilliant take, this is the genius level take, and so the basic take is basically Puerto Rico's a floating island of garbage. Then the more brilliant take is American carnage. That's kind of what Trump said famously in his inauguration speech, that America had become garbage, and uh, calling this territory, uh, which is obviously the you know one Hispanic political entity in the country, calling it garbage, but the rest of the country not garbage, is a real climb down. It's a real backing away from this more radical critique. But then maybe the genius level take is what Pope Francis, like Trump, a very disruptive figure capable of speaking in very sharp, immediate terms, what Pope Francis said early in his papacy, which is, the world is more and more becoming an immense pile of filth. That was one of his classic early tweets. So that's maybe the another synthesis.
Yeah, and I mean, in a sense, I think that does it speaks to something important about these closing messages. Just to kind of bring it back to that, which is, the Trump message is geared towards people who do think things are that there are things that are profoundly wrong, that with how the country is being run, that need a systematic response, or maybe not systematic, because that's not a term I would associate with Trump, but that need an extremely aggressive response. And that ultimately part of the reason that Harris is, perhaps is struggling to articulate a meaningful closing message is, ultimately she wants to go back to this sort of, essentially what Clinton, what Hillary offered, which was, America is already great, everything's fine, just let the same class of kind of technocrats stay in charge and keep doing the same things, and everything will be fine, versus this American carnage thing. But the reality is, of course, that the American carnage one, it had significant, very wide ranging impacts in terms of the vision that was implemented, not only by Trump but by Biden, in ways we've discussed and covered before. That there has been a profound shift in how the country is being run, and those battles are still being fought, within both coalitions that were kind of unleashed out of that populist upsurge. And I think in some sense, maybe, to some extent, both parties don't quite know what to do with that, because, in part because maybe their coalitions are so sort of contradictory. But it's striking. I think if you're the party of, we need to return to the normalcy represented by like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, that's just a bad message. Not in part because the Biden administration itself didn't really look at it that way, right? And in fact, it took a much more transformational approach with very mixed results. But it's just, and then at the same time, I think Trump can't quite do American carnage anymore, perhaps because he was in power for 4 years. He did have an effect on the country. So the idea that he's simply going to be a radical break with everything that came before doesn't really work either, because he was in office before, and the results are out there for people to see. So it's a weird moment of kind of, in a sense, revisiting the 2016 divide, and clearly it being a closely contested election in the same way. So I think we're revisiting 2016, but a lot has happened since then, and neither party seems to be quite able to figure out how to make sense of that or come up with an entirely compelling response to it.
With that, thanks, Sohrab. Thank you, Geoff. Go to compactmag.com/subscribe. We'll have lots more coverage of this election and of other matters in the coming days.